back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. We're going to continue the discussion on Time Traveler Records today and their new Muse Reissue series. So in a recent video, I talked about the Kenny Barron title, and today I'm going to be covering Cosmos Nucleus by Carlos Garnett. As always, go ahead and hit subscribe so that you're notified in the future whenever I post a video. Of course, you can also find me on Instagram. I'm at what_can_brown. And don't forget to check out my new label. Our first release is coming out on October 24th. The label is called Gamut Recordings, and the release is the 1957 Mode recording of Pepper Adams Quintet. So just a couple of comments about the Muse Reissue series. I know I covered this in the last video, but for those who haven't checked that out. So Time Traveler Recordings is tackling the Muse catalog. They're going to put several new titles out every single quarter. The three titles that were released up front include Kenny Barron's Sunset to Dawn, Roy Brooks' The Free Slave, and Carlos Garnett's Cosmos Nucleus. They're all coming out on October 17th. The details in terms of the production on this are that it was mastered from the original tapes by Matthew Luthans at the Mastering Lab. It's on 180 gram vinyl. It's pressed at Optimal Media, accompanied by glossy tip-on jackets by Stoughton, and there's new liner sort of note essays in the form of like a single sheet front and back. In terms of the label Time Traveler, Zeb Feldman is behind it, of Resonance, Elemental, and Jazz Detective. The other producer is James Batsford, who owns and operates Newland out of the UK, who also put out fantastic releases. And certainly the material for all of these is licensed from Craft Recordings and Concord. So I'm gonna kind of now sort of set aside maybe some of the particulars of how this is put together and talk a little bit more about the content, about the musicians, that kind of thing. And I'm going to venture a guess to say that not as many folks out there know who Carlos Garnett was, and maybe not as many who knew Kenny Barron, who, by the way, is still with us. And let's be real, if you focus on labels from the 1950s and 60s, as I know a lot of people do, you may not know who either of these musicians were. So just kind of briefly, Carlos Garnett, he was a saxophonist who first appeared on Freddie Hubbard's A Soul Experiment. I think that was like a 1969 album for Atlantic. He also soon played with the Jazz Messengers. He played with Miles Davis, which no doubt led to him getting to lead his own recording date. So he would record 5 albums for Muse in the 1970s. I think that there might have been one significantly later as well. But Cosmos Nucleus, that we have right here, was the 4th recording that he put out for Muse, and it was in 1976. All of his albums are worth seeking out, in my opinion, but you may have to spend a little bit of money to get an original copy. So just an original of this particular album in decent shape is going to set you back a couple $100. So I think one thing to note is that besides his very first release titled Journey to Enlightenment, his others for Muse anyway, are with larger groups of musicians. So Cosmos Nucleus here is one of the largest lineups with 8 additional saxophones in addition to Carlos Garnett, 7 trumpets, 3 trombones, bass, bongos, congas, vocals on a few tracks, guitar, drums, and electric piano. So interestingly, in terms of that format, with so many musicians, Garnett actually gives a bit of a platform to a bunch of really young musicians here, so you may not actually recognize them because some of them, this was their only recording. And in fact, even the most recognizable name here isn't who you think it is, because you will see Cecil McBee's name in the lineup as being a bass player, but guess what? It's not the Cecil McBee you know, it's Cecil McBee Jr., his son. We also have Billy Cobham's brother William and Cal Massey's son Zane involved in this. So it's kind of like an interesting thing in that it's a big band, and also that Carlos Garnett kind of gave a little bit of a platform to some of these other lesser known musicians. So I mentioned there's a big band, and I know big band is a little bit of a 4-letter word for some folks who are otherwise jazz appreciators. And this big band feel is especially the case on a couple of tracks. Really the title track definitely, which is a 12-minute sort of sprawling piece that does have a few solos, but not as many as you'd think for that duration. It's certainly more than a solo vehicle. I think it's about the arrangement and the sort of overlapping melodies. Stylistically, certainly with this opening piece as well as generally, this is fusion. And again, it does borrow from big band, but also has a very 70s feel in terms of, well, just stylistically, the use of the electric guitar, the electric bass. I think that the unison horn lines are used to kind of set up a like a funk kind of vibe, and are often used as accents to either the soloist or the playing of the melody or the vocalist, depending on the piece. And I will say more than that. There's a little bit of what I sometimes call a 70s haze to the recording. And what I mean by that is that the intent with the recording isn't for that in-room sound. It has more in common with like funk and soul recordings of the late 70s. Maybe a similar vibe to some of the Mizell Brothers releases that are both very well produced with dense sound and not as much separation of instruments and sonic detail. Now, don't get me wrong, you still get some of that, especially in the form of the hand drums that stand out nicely, especially on the track Mystery of Ages. But otherwise, I think due to the size of the group and the sort of dynamics that they play with, it's going to come across as a little bit more of like a party record and less like a carefully constructed, sort of nuanced, small combo performance. One of the strongest tracks I think on this album is actually the shortest, and it's titled "Wise Old Men." This is one with a vocalist, incidentally, and I really like the horn lines on this one. I think also that even though Carlos Garnett's solo is very brief, it sounds fantastic. So I know on the Kenny Barron title, Sunset to Dawn, I was able to have a really brief discussion on how it compared to the original. In this case, I've never owned a copy of this album, and in fact, it was the first time I've heard the music, so I haven't even streamed it before. That in and of itself, I think, is fantastic that they decided to release this, because this is one of those albums I think that I just kind of been waiting to find on vinyl before I listened to it. That being said, I'm a fan of Carlos Garnett. I do have a few of his other titles for Muse, so not just this one. So with that being said, how does it kind of sound on its own in terms of this edition, right? So I'll summarize some of my earlier comments and say it's very much a product, I guess, of that late 70s era in sound. And I will say that the rhythms and sort of repeating kind of vamps are, very infectious. Like, this is the sort of music that if you DJ, it'll get people tapping their toes or maybe on the dance floor. There are a lot of vocals here. But they don't distract from the performance of the band. So I don't think that the songs here are meant to highlight the vocalist per se. It's part of the vibe that they set, I think. In terms of the overall group, it's the vocals contribute to the vibe that the overall group sets, rather than it being like a vocal-led performance. There is one track on this album that is much more streamlined, and it's called Kafira, which is a really beautiful ballad. And honestly, I think that it's probably going to be most people's favorite, because it's probably the best Carlos Garnett highlight, and he certainly sounds amazing on that track. So with that, obviously, I'm excited to finally be able to hear this great music. I think I mentioned this up front, but it's available for pre-order now. It's actually out on October 17th, which is coming up very soon. So to find this or the other ones, you can't find Time Traveler Records as a standalone website. So you're going to kind of have to check out music retailers. So you can buy from Acoustic Sounds. Yes, you can buy from Amazon. Yes, you could buy from Music Direct. Of course, I think that there is the opportunity here to try and support your local shop and check in with them to see if they're getting any copies in. So, thanks everyone for kind of entertaining this part 2 discussion on Time Traveler, and there'll be part 3 with Roy Brooks coming up very soon. So, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.